Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's program. We will be discussing Shine of the Ever, a collection of short stories with author Claire Rudy Foster. This collection is a short story exploring what binds a community of queer and trans people as they negotiate love, screwing up, and learning to forgive themselves for being young and sometimes foolish. For those interested, this book is available to check out online via our Hoopla and Overdrive platforms. First, I'd like to introduce myself and my colleague. My name is Celia Avila, and this is Edwin Rodarte. We are two of the chairs for the Los Angeles Public Library's LGBTQIA Services Committee. Joining us today is Claire Rudy Foster. Foster is a queer, non-binary trans writer from Portland, Oregon. Their work on sex, identity, relationships, and recovery appears in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and McSweeney's, among others. Foster is the author of I've Never Done This Before. Their essays and fiction have been recognized for excellence, including 4 nominations for the Pushcart Prize. Foster holds an MFA in creative writing and teaches writing workshops in Portland. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here virtually.
So first, we'd like to begin by asking you to read a piece from Shine of the Ever.
Sure. This piece is called The Pixies, and it's the first piece in the collection Shine of the Ever. Our parents all think we're weirdos. We're not good enough for them, but we're good enough for each other. The music is too loud, and we are packed tighter than canned tuna, shoulder against shoulder, heads moving more or less in rhythm as if in agreement. Yes, we are the fuck-ups. Yes, we'll disappoint you. We did it wrong. We win at making better mistakes. Some of us look like punks and some don't, but we're all wearing the costume of belonging. We're not welcome in your church, you know. This club is our church, and it's loud, loud, loud. The voice of God is in the bass reverb and the lyrics rising incantation. You told us that we were as good as dead. You said we have that gay disease. You copy and steal from us. You never give credit. You're desperate to catch whatever we've got. We congregate to forget how sick you make us. We don't distinguish between wrong and right. We are what is real. The singer has a voice like fighting tigers. She raises her microphone over the crowd of ecstatic faces, and we shout back to her. The sound pushes on the walls, ceiling, floor, growling into something massive and golden. When we're together, we forget that we are hopeless. We are something else, and we are part of each other. We will never fit. Why would we want to be like you? Go to school, get some debt and a silly job. We might even get married now that it's legal. But what's the point of acting straight? We're no good at it anyway. You tell us all the time. We will do things our way. We will stomp to the office in work boots and wear safety pins in our ears. We will leave the glitter in our eyebrows after pride. We will grow old gracelessly and live in sin and teach our children to argue with anyone, even us, even God. Even I'll adore you, we sing, even as our hearts ball up in our throats. If Darwin was right, we are better than you. My Valoria. The chorus comes and we are a mass of bliss and fury and love and pain and truth and sound. Finally, through the roof, we are going to shake you loose. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great, actually. It was one of my favorite stories.
Yeah, thank you.
In the book, can you talk about what the Pixies means to you and why they are so integral to your book?
I am definitely someone who came of age in the grunge era, which, depending on who you ask, goes anywhere from 1992 to like maybe 2004. In Portland, things don't change very quickly culturally. We're usually the last to get the word from LA, a couple years behind the curve. For me, when I came of age, grunge was a really big deal. And there were and still are very few women and gender non-conforming people in rock music, especially in like, bigger acts. So when I was a kid, there were two women who were just awesome, and they were Kim Gordon from Sonic Youth and Kim Deal from the Pixies. And you liked one or the other, like, Ginger or Mary Ann, but rock and roll. So for me, like, grunge and especially the Pixies represented a time in my life when you could kind of just be a slacker. It was garage music. You would hang out and listen to this weird raucous noise that was still at the same time very moving. And there was a lot of like, exciting energy around that scene. And like I said, Portland is the last to change. So the Pixies were they're still kind of a hometown band here, even though they're not from Portland.
Great.
That's great. Sorry. Your book explores different identities within the LGBT plus spectrum. How did you find the different voices for each character, and where did those characters come from?
These characters they're all imaginary. Most of them are amalgamates of people and experiences I've had myself. I never feel entitled to speak for somebody else. One of my favorite jokes is that, I contain multitudes is like a white woman proverb. I'm just out here containing multitudes. I just felt really called to write in all of these voices that have nothing to do with my experience. And I didn't want to do that in my own work. I think that as someone who's very proudly a member of the LGBTQ plus community, I really wanted to be true to the people who I loved. So these characters, some of them come out of, individual observations. Often for me, my stories are, they're inspired by maybe a line of dialogue, a line of lyrics, a relationship dynamic that I want to explore. But for the most part, when I was working on these, what I was thinking about was, why don't queer people have happy endings? So often in the media and in fiction, on television, in movies, queer people are, especially queer people of color, are sort of a punchline. Or, like they're the tragedy that happens off stage. Or if there's two of them, they're obviously dating each other. Or they're giving advice to the clueless straight friend and like trying to spruce them up, sort of like a Queer Eye situation. And I thought in each of these stories, what kind of character would resist those stereotypes? What kind of character would push against that expectation and do something for themselves instead of fulfilling this sort of prophecy that we seem to be given when we come out as queer? I think it goes without saying that there are so many expectations that come with being queer. When I came out to my family, I was told that I was going to be alone and that I was too unlovable, that I would never have a normal life. I'd never have a normal marriage or a partnership, that my parenting would suffer, that I would not be able to find a job. And in some cases, that's true. People in our community face a terrific amount of discrimination, again, especially if they're not white. And I wanted to write in these stories characters who succeeded anyway, in small ways, who find partners who care for them and understand, or, people who are able to leave abusive relationships and start their own lives. So it was less about the character as an individual and more about what they represent in terms of what's possible for queer people.
Thank you for those stories, by the way. I really enjoyed, each and every one of them, and I think the story that they each tell and their ability to deal with the problems and their individuality was very evident. It was great. So, thanks for having more stories like that, I think.
Yeah, it's important.
Life doesn't begin or end with coming out, as it turns out. There's a lot more.
Your book captures and documents Portland at a moment in time and explores the relationships between your characters and the changing city. What are your feelings about Portland now? How does it figure into your current writing?
Oh, I'm conflicted. I maybe you're like this too, but I get so defensive when people talk shit about it. Like, no way, man. Nobody dumps on Portland except for me. You know? And it's a conflicted love. Portland is really backwards in some ways. It's this racist hamlet in the Pacific Northwest. It was founded as like a KKK stronghold in a white flight state. Our laws are extremely backwards up here, and they exclude people of color and non-mainstream types. And yet the white people who live here think that they're very progressive. And so, the tension of that, I tried to put that in my book as well, is, a lot of people who essentially live in a majority white state never have to confront their racism. They have no black friends. To a white person in an all white environment, whiteness isn't a problem. So I tried to take that same attitude and unpack it in my book and say, well, in a state and in a city where people think of themselves as very progressive, what are those hidden attitudes toward queer people? And I show that oftentimes in this book in terms of people's relationship to faith, inclusion in churches, in spiritual spaces. In one of these stories, Littermates, the character is non-binary trans and just hates labels, just is not going to let you label them, really not into it. But they get into this tense moment with someone who is offering a food box from a church. And the access to resources is, the straight person who has the power, the cis woman who's a representative of this church, is a gatekeeper for these life-saving resources. And although this person is a member of a group that literally says, love your neighbor, they do not love this character. So it's these small things, we would call them a microaggression, I guess. But in fact, the microaggression is just a symptom of a much larger aspect of bigotry and prejudice that anyone who's not, who's non-normative, not white, not straight, not partnered, not wealthy, is going to face to one degree or another.
Yeah. I know exactly which story you're talking about, and which scene. It's infuriating. So can you share with us a little bit about your process from idea to finished story? And do you go through many drafts of your stories before you compile them together?
I do. The stories in this book, I started writing the title story in the summer of 2004. So that was 10,000 years ago. And the most recent one, I think, was just a year or so prior to publication. So I didn't conceive of this as a short story collection at first. I had what was essentially a novella, the title story. And then I had a handful of stories that no matter where I sent them, they just kept getting rejected. People weren't interested. It wasn't the right time. And when I took those stories and put them together, I realized that they all had some very common themes, which is that they were queer people doing things that, stereotypically we're not supposed to do. We're not supposed to be happy. We're not supposed to be independent. And I thought, well, if I put these together, I noticed that they're actually speaking to each other. So, in these pieces, I took all of them, and it was like, I was like a conspiracy theorist. Like, I put them all on the wall and started moving stuff around. I made a chart. There's a map. And I noticed that when they were speaking to each other, I started editing them all as one larger piece. So less working on an individual story than saying, okay, what gaps can I fill in to make this feel like more of a community story? So even the ones that have been published or have been worked on for quite an amount of time were different in conversation with these others. My process is that I write it, I rewrite it, I read it out loud. And most importantly, I read it in the voice of someone who absolutely can't stand me. I I do. I imagine my worst critic reading this and being like, "Oh, is that really? That's what you think? Huh?
Was that it?
Yeah, it is. Is that all? That's cute." You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
If I can get through the hater filter, it's probably fine. I never write for people who want to agree with me. I write for people who dislike and don't trust me.
So
great.
from the get-go, you saw then some of the connectedness between the stories, or was it something that just evolved, I think, over time? I know that you talked about a little about the process and how to order them, but I know that I read them out of sequence. So I know that, yeah, I did. Yeah, I was actually interested in just like jumping in and out, but you could still get the, yeah. I still got the gist and the connectedness between all of them. Yeah.
I mean, for me, like I said, I have very conflicted feelings about Portland. I always wanted to be kind of like cosmopolitan, like Los Angeles, New York, Paris, cool cities, big cities, not, towns. But, whether I like it or not, I've lived in Portland since 2002. And this seems to be home, whether I accept that or not. And I just can't stop writing about Portland. So for me, the connection wasn't just queerness, it was locations. And once I started looking at the actual, the dive bar names, for example, or the places where they're going, the way that the city's connected by bike paths, that kind of stuff. When I looked at the geography of the city, I saw that there were a lot of connections just geographically. When I was writing the title story, I had initially fantasized about writing teeny tiny, maybe 150, 200 word flash pieces for every notable landmark in Portland. So you would be able to like go from place to place in my city and like read a story about something that was real or imagined that happened on this place. But that never really happened. But this book is sort of an extension of that dream, that initial vision.
If that ever does come to pass, I would be very interested in that.
I'll put you in it.
There you
go. Yeah, you had asked if I had highlighted stuff, and that would be exactly the type of thing that I highlighted. So looking forward to it. You talked a little bit about the different emotions in the book. There are a lot of shiny moments of hope and joy and strength, and there's a lot of pain and vulnerability and alienation. Was it difficult to navigate the emotional landscape and the process of writing the stories, or did it all just come together?
That's an interesting question. I feel like writing about emotions is easier for me when I've had them myself and spent some time processing them, say, in therapy. I think that a lot of writers use fiction as a form of fantasy for themselves, like, what if I was like this? What if I did that? And, it's empowering in that way. For me, writing about emotion can't be cathartic. I can't write about feelings in order to process them. This is all like old news. So I think the emotionality or the moving parts of the story, so to speak, I was less focused on my own feelings and more focused on how the reader is going to feel reading these stories. It's, as we said earlier, the music of this time is a huge influence on how I write. And I try to write less like a fiction writer and more like a songwriter, where I'm not writing necessarily to tell you a story, I'm writing to move you. And I feel that if you were moved, you got your money's worth.
Yeah, I saw the theme, obviously the Pixies are there, but just even the cover, the whole
the mixtape.
The mixtape, yeah. So music is very present, I think, in the book as well.
Yeah, we were definitely moved. So good job.
Yeah.
We were actually listening to the Pixies before.
Really?
Yes, I found a playlist on YouTube, but so I actually listened to quite a few of the songs since I actually had not heard about them. I had heard about it, I just never heard them before. So that's on me.
A trip down memory lane
Mhm.
to the memories we never had.
Speaking about writers and writing, do you have like, who are your mentors, or like, do you have mentors in terms of like who you look up to? Yeah,
That's a great question. From a very young age, I think I just wanted to be a writer. I knew that that's what I was. I loved the more technical authors, the writers who like John Steinbeck, The Black Pearl, I think it was, the novella. I read that as a very young person and thought, man, there's a lot happening here. This is really weird. Marquez, I loved 100 Years of Solitude. These really incredible technicians. It was like being, when I went to the library, which was like heaven for me. That's my favorite place. It still is. Like, I miss my library. But I just remember going to the library, and I felt the same excitement that I think some people going to like a NASCAR race, because you're surrounded by like really high octane, really beautifully tuned manuscripts. You're surrounded by these like primed creations that other people put years and years into. I studied them. I didn't have access to other writers when I was younger, so most of my writing is self-educated. When I finally did undergo an MFA program, it was really refreshing to have one-on-one contact with people who were like real writers, like Pam Houston, Tayari Jones, Jack Driscoll, Claire Davis, just incredible writers. Benjamin Percy, who is an awesome technician himself. I got a lot more information about what it means to actually sit down and work on a piece. And now, I've been writing on my own for some years, but I did actually just join a writing group. And it only took me a decade to like maybe be okay with that. So, for me, it's not about mentorship necessarily, but it is really about community. I learned from going to school and from talking to other writers that there is no art by committee. There's no focus group that's going to sit down and write an amazing story. That doesn't, that's not something that happens for me. But there is no story without community. And so even if I'm just writing to please myself, like, I need to know who's going to be reading it and how they feel about it. And I think in many ways that's more important than how I feel when I'm composing all by myself.
Okay. So before I ask my next question, we do want to mention that we'll have some time for audience questions. So if you have any, feel free to put them in the chat, and we can always cue that up to ask next as well. Also, your love of libraries was evident in Shine of the Ever, where you're talking about the card catalog.
Yes.
That's great. Yes. And just like venturing down that rabbit hole was wonderful. So you did mention this a little bit in the last question, but do you have any other favorite writers that you would recommend or that you really look up to other than the ones you mentioned?
Again, like, I really err on the side of writers who write well within their genre and who have really good, this is so nerdy, like, writers who write good sentences. I'm like, that sentence. I just finished reading the second mystery novel by Rosalie Knecht. It's the second one in the Vera Kelly series. The first one is Who is Vera Kelly? And the second is called Vera Kelly is Not a Mystery. And it's incredible. It's set in sort of the Mad Men era, and it's about a gay female spy who is embedded in Argentina and later in the Caribbean during the Cold War. And the writing is just phenomenal, and it's also a really good, just like basic, like, it's a gumshoe movie. It's sort of like The Maltese Falcon. You're just like, it's tense, it's exciting. The historical detail is fantastic. I've been really, really enjoying that. My other books that I read, I also, a friend of mine lent me this unusually timely book by Anthony Bourdain that I had not read before, and it's called Typhoid Mary. And I really recommend it if you can find a copy of it. I think it was only published in the UK. And it is, I mean, Bourdain, you know, the cook's cook. It's his perspective on the life of Typhoid Mary, who was also a cook. And as far as I know, the only account of a cook's life by a cook. And it talks about class, race, disease, transmittable diseases, you know, why people kept getting sick in Mary's kitchen, and what her life was like as sort of a pariah, and also an example of institutionalized treatment for people who were not interested, you know, people who were asymptomatic carriers and not interested in getting better. So I really, really enjoyed that one too. It was quite tense. And he just has such a lovely voice. You know, I was reading this book and I'm like, God, I miss Anthony Bourdain. It was great.
I always love asking these questions because then my just reading list, my to be read list just keeps growing.
Never ending.
Fantastic. They're fantastic.
Let me see. Sorry. Is there anything that you're currently working on that we can look forward to? Another book coming out?
Oh, I'm always hoping another book will come out. I'm currently working on a memoir because I'm very old. I'm teasing. I mean, I'm the oldest trans person I know, but I'm not old. I'm only 36. I'm writing a memoir about the parallel processes of my transition, my medical transition, and parenthood. I'm writing about my pregnancy. My son is 12, and I haven't met a lot of other trans people who underwent a biological pregnancy and are now raising children. I think that's kind of an unusual experience. And with so much emphasis on, you know, the trans body and like, what do you look like? And, you know, what is your body like? What is your sex life like? There's a lot of, you know, the trans people are sort of sexualized in these odd ways. You get a lot of questions about biology, which is weird. It's like, I don't know shit about biology, man. So I'm working on that memoir. I'm also cleaning up a novel. You know, I'm always busy. I'm always busy doing something.
Right. No, that sounds like a great new title to come out. Just add it to the library for sure.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I hope you'll like it. Yeah, most of what I'm doing right now is I'm a senior features editor for the Rumpus, and I get to read these incredible essays by other writers and work on them and sort of bring those to fruition. I recently edited this wonderful piece by a principal dancer of the New York City Ballet who talked about dancing Balanchine during quarantine, and specifically dancing the role of like a plague character when he's still on stage. It was just fantastic, just such an unusual perspective. And I don't know, editing is my lens on the world now. It helps me travel when I can't leave my house.
Just a lot these days.
Yeah. You get very creative in quarantine.
Let's see. We don't have any questions yet. So is there any advice that you would like to give young writers or editors that are, you know, trying to find their voice?
Write a lot. Write a lot. Don't worry about getting published. Write to please yourself, and not because you think it's going to impress other people. No one is impressed. I don't know. Advice for writers. Yeah, just for me, reading something out loud is usually the step that I need in editing. You know, when something is pleasing to the ear and makes sense when it's read aloud, it's just, I think as children, for many people, that's one of our first pleasures. You know, like going to story hour at the library, or a parent reads to you, or another caregiver, a teacher maybe. My first experience of story was always auditory. And so the music of our language, I think it's very easy to get tied up in your ego and, you know, to try to be clever on the page, and all that just dissolves when it's read out loud. So that would be my advice to writers at any point in their careers. Read your shit out loud and see if you still like it.
It's good advice.
Yes. I was gonna maybe add, I think Hannah says, what writers inspire you? You did talk a little bit about that already. I was wondering, though, if you might, and I don't know if you have another passage from your book that you may be willing to read to us, so that those watching us can also hear some of the stories.
Let me find one here. One of the themes of the book is, the connection of community and sort of finding community where you can. There's also a connection between human beings, which is really important. I'd like to read a little bit from the beginning of the title story, Shine of the Ever. Meeting. The year before the year I quit drinking was one of the last best years of my life. The drinking wasn't great, obviously, but everything else was. It was 2006, but it felt like 1998, just before everyone discovered my hometown and Portland became a destination. That year is special to me because it was the last time the city and I were really together in the way that couples and families and best friends are together. Every moment from that year is like a pin on the map in my heart. It's a red thumbtack on the corner of 19th and Jefferson, for example, marking a place where I once had a sandwich with someone who left for Istanbul the next day. Like Portland, he was someone I loved and will probably never see again. The patio where we drank syrupy root beers and teased each other about being young and dumb is gone now. It's condos. Future condos, anyway. The sign out front says every unit starts at a very affordable $500,000 each. And the sandwich was a Reuben, for the record. We split the pickle. Since I got sober, Portland has done nothing but break my heart. I stay. It's where everything that ever mattered happened to me. The last year of my drinking, I was 23, but still not ready to grow up. And neither was Portland. The city and I were flexing, testing our limits. We were both at the end of what felt like very long and sheltered childhoods. In retrospect, everything I said and felt and did at 23 was not unique, except in that it happened to me. Who wasn't a mess in 2006? I believed I'd never get any older back then. I didn't believe that Portland or I would ever change. Every time another vacant lot filled up with high-rise apartments or another historic building was razed and replaced by a parking garage, I felt as if the world was ending. I mean, it was. It kind of still is.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
So that passage is important because I think for a lot of queer people, we're sort of inventing our history on the way down. There's community is important, but it's difficult to find older gay people or older queer people. The AIDS crisis eliminated almost an entire generation of queer people. And so with Portland and in the queer community, it always feels to me like there's a history like right under the history. It's like we were here, but then who is here before us? We don't know. We have these milestones in our collective history, but who was where and what they said and what it meant and all that stuff. It feels largely imaginary to me.
Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I guess with that, we'll finish up our little discussion here. Thank you so much for being here with us. We really appreciated it.
I'm really pleased. It was great meeting you both.
Yeah, Edwin and I are huge fans now.
Yeah, well, likewise.
So before we go, we would like to thank Erica Silverman from our Silver Lake branch library for helping us put today's program together. And then we just also want to remind everybody that the book is available for checkout immediately on Hoopla and also on the Overdrive platform. So thank you so much for being with us today, Foster.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy Pride Month.
Happy Pride Month.
Oh, it looks like we have comments. People, the book club from Silver Lake love your book. And Barbara loves the personification of Portland in your writing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, again. All right, we're going to end the broadcast.